3 days after I buried my father, his accountant called me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. I was sitting at the kitchen table of my childhood home in Millbrook, Georgia, surrounded by casserole dishes from neighbors I hadn't seen in years, still wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral, because I hadn't been able to make myself change. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. I stared at it for 4 rings. Something made me answer. His name was Walter Pruitt. He'd been my father's accountant for 11 years. I recognized the name immediately. Dad had mentioned him occasionally, the way you mention someone who handles the parts of your life you don't want to think about. Taxes, quarterly filings, the kind of paperwork that piles up when you own a small construction business for 30 years. Mr. Shandy. Pruitt's voice was careful, measured, like someone choosing every word before they let it out. He said he had found something in my father's files, something he believed I needed to see, something that could not wait. And then he said the sentence that made my hand go cold around the phone. "Do not bring your brother," he said. "Come alone. Do not tell him you're coming." I opened my mouth to ask why. But something in the silence that followed, something in the way he was breathing, shallow and careful, like a man standing very still near something dangerous, made me close it again. "I will explain everything when I see you," he said. "Please, come tomorrow morning." He gave me an address. I wrote it on the back of a sympathy card from someone named Deborah, who I'm fairly certain I've never met. Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time after that. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. Down the hall, in my father's bedroom, his reading glasses were still on the nightstand next to a half-finished library book about the American Civil War. He'd had 63 pages left. He would never know how it ended. My brother Kevin had been staying in the house too, in his old bedroom at the end of the hall. We hadn't spoken much since the funeral. We never spoke much, if I'm being honest. There were 4 years between us and what felt like 400 miles of something I could never quite name, not hatred, not indifference, just this persistent low hum of distance, like a radio station you can almost tune in but never quite reach. I heard him moving around in the kitchen around 10 that night. I didn't go out. I just kept staring at the address on the back of Deborah's sympathy card. My father's name was Robert Hadley. People in Millbrook called him Bobby. He built houses for a living. Not fancy ones. Not the kind you see in magazines, but solid ones. The kind that stand up to Georgia summers and the occasional hurricane threat and 30 years of a family living hard inside them. He was proud of that. He used to say that a house was only as honest as the man who built it. He died on a Tuesday. Heart attack, the doctor said. He was 61 years old. He'd had a stress test 6 months earlier, and his doctor told him he was in good shape. He was walking the dog when it happened, on the same 2-mile loop he walked every morning before work. The dog came home without him. That's how I found out. My father's neighbor called me because the dog had shown up at her door alone, and when she went to check on Dad, she found him on the sidewalk near the corner of Magnolia and 3rd. I drove 4 hours from Atlanta the same night. Kevin drove down from Nashville the next morning. By the time we were standing together in the kitchen the following afternoon, something already felt off about my brother. He arrived with a rolling suitcase, which I thought was strange for what was supposed to be a 3-day stay. He asked within the first hour if Dad had left a will. I told him I didn't know, that I assumed the attorney would be in touch, and Kevin nodded slowly in a way that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. He made a phone call outside that evening, standing in the backyard near the fence, and when I watched from the kitchen window, his body language was tight, his free hand opening and closing at his side. I told myself it was grief. That was the explanation I kept reaching for, the way you reach for a railing in the dark. Grief makes people act strange. 3 days after the funeral, Walter Pruitt called me. I didn't sleep that night. His office was downtown, on the 2nd floor of a building that had been a hardware store in a previous life. The stairs were narrow. The carpet was the kind of brown that's been brown for so long it's forgotten it was ever another color. I got there at 8:15 in the morning, 15 minutes early, and sat in the small waiting area while a ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Walter Pruitt was a small man in his late 60s with the careful eyes of someone who'd been looking at other people's money for decades. He shook my hand and led me back to his office and closed the door and didn't offer coffee, which told me something. When someone doesn't offer coffee, the conversation isn't going to be the kind that benefits from comfort. He sat down. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at me for a moment like he was deciding how much of a thing to say. "Your father came to see me 6 weeks ago," he said. "Not for tax purposes. He had something he needed to tell someone, and he trusted me. I waited." "What he told me is going to be difficult to hear," Mr. Pruitt said. "And I want to say first that your father loved you very much. He talked about you often. He was proud of you in ways that I don't think he was always good at expressing." I felt my throat tighten. "Please," I said. "Just tell me." So he did. 6 weeks before my father died, he had discovered that money was missing from Hadley Construction. Not a little money. Not a rounding error or a bookkeeping mistake. Over the previous 18 months, approximately $240,000 had been moved out of the company's operating accounts through a series of transfers that were carefully structured to stay just below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank review. Small enough individually to overlook, large enough accumulated to hollow the company out. Dad had noticed because he was meticulous about his accounts, the way some people are meticulous about their lawns. Not obsessively, but consistently, quietly, the way you notice when something is 3 degrees off from where it should be. He'd gone back through 18 months of statements. He'd found the pattern, and then he traced it. The transfers were authorized using his own login credentials, Mr. Pruitt told me, but from a device he didn't own. A laptop registered to an address in Nashville. My brother Kevin had been the office manager for Hadley Construction for 4 years. He had access to everything. Payroll, accounts payable, the company credit line. He'd moved back to Nashville 3 years ago, but he still worked remotely, still had full system access, still called Dad every Sunday the way a good son does. $240,000. I sat very still in Walter Pruitt's office and listened to the ceiling fan turn. Dad confronted him. Mr. Pruitt said quietly. 2 weeks before he died, he drove up to Nashville and sat down with Kevin in person. He didn't call the police first. He didn't hire a lawyer. He drove up to see his son. "What happened?" I asked. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere further away than my body. Kevin denied it at first. Then, when your father showed him the records, he admitted it. He said he'd been in financial trouble. Gambling debts. Serious ones, to people who don't wait politely for repayment. He said he'd always intended to pay it back. He said he was sorry. And then? Your father told him he had 60 days to return the money or he would go to the police. He told Kevin he loved him, but that he couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. He told me all of this when he came here the following week. Mr. Pruitt paused, looking at his hands. He was devastated, but he was clear. He knew what he had to do. I was gripping the arms of the chair. I made myself let go. "He died 2 weeks later," I said. "Yes, and you think?" "I don't know what I think," Mr. Pruitt said carefully. "Your father was 61. He had some underlying risk factors the stress test might not have caught. A heart attack is not impossible, but the timing, I repeated. He reached into his desk drawer and placed a manila folder on the desk between us. "Your father left this with me. He said that if anything happened to him before the 60 days were up, I should give it to you. Not to Kevin. To you specifically." I stared at the folder. He said you were the one who would know what to do with it. The folder contained 3 things. Bank statements going back 22 months, with the fraudulent transfers highlighted in yellow, a flash drive, and a handwritten note from my father on Hadley Construction letterhead in his cramped, practical handwriting that I'd known all my life. The note said, "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was trying to protect both of you, which was probably stupid, but that's your old man for you. The drive has everything. Be careful. Kevin's not the only person involved. Dad, I read it 4 times. Then I asked Mr. Pruitt if I could use his bathroom. I sat on the closed lid of the toilet for about 8 minutes and pressed my hands flat against my thighs and breathed. I was 31 years old. My father had been dead for 6 days. I had stood at his grave and scattered Georgia red clay dirt onto his casket, and I had held it together. And now I was sitting in a stranger's bathroom trying to understand what my brother had done. Kevin's not the only person involved. I drove back to the house with the folder on the passenger seat. Kevin's rental car was in the driveway. I parked on the street. I sat there for a long time before going inside. You have to understand something about my brother. He is 3 inches taller than me and has our father's eyes and has always known exactly how to make me feel like the younger sibling even though I'm older, not through cruelty. Kevin was never cruel, exactly. It was subtler than that. He had a way of handling situations, of stepping in with a calm, competent authority that made it seem like he was solving problems when actually he was positioning himself at the center of things. When our mother got sick 8 years ago, Kevin was the one who coordinated the doctors, talked to the insurance company, handled the family communications. Everyone praised him for it. I told myself I was grateful. What I didn't say out loud was that I'd sometimes felt, during that terrible year, like I'd been quietly pushed to the side of my own family's crisis. Like I was a supporting character in a story that was being told without my input. I went inside the house. Kevin was at the kitchen table on his laptop. He looked up when I came in and gave me the half smile he always deployed for neutral moments. "You were out early," he said. "Errands," I said. My voice was steady. I went to my room. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. My father, it turned out, had been thorough in a way I hadn't expected. The drive contained the bank records Mr. Pruitt had already shown me, but also something else: audio files. Dad had recorded his confrontation with Kevin in Nashville. I put in earbuds and pressed play, hearing my father's voice. That specific voice, the one that called me every Sunday and told bad puns and asked about my job in the patient way of someone who doesn't entirely understand what a marketing coordinator does but is proud of you anyway, was like being punched in the chest. I had to pause the recording and just sit there for a moment. Then I pressed play again. The conversation was 42 minutes long. For the first 20 minutes, Kevin denied everything. He was convincing. He sounded hurt, even. He said he didn't know what Dad was looking at, but that those numbers didn't look right to him either, and maybe they should bring in an outside auditor. He sounded like a man being falsely accused. Then Dad read him the timestamps. The specific login times. The IP addresses cross-referenced to Kevin's home network in Nashville. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Then Kevin's voice changed. He didn't become the person I didn't recognize. That would have been easier. He became quieter, more controlled, and in that control, I recognized something that had always been there under the surface. A calculation. A stillness. The part of Kevin that has always been very good at figuring out how situations can be managed. He said he'd needed the money. He said the people he owed were serious people and he hadn't had options. He said he'd been moving money around to cover the hole and had been planning to pay it back once he sorted out his situation. He said he was sorry over and over in the particular way that means, "I'm sorry I got caught." Dad said he needed the money returned within 60 days or he would involve the police. His voice was steady in a way that cost him something, I could tell. I knew my father's voice. Kevin said, "Dad, you have to give me more time than that." Dad said, 60 days, Kevin. Then Kevin said something that I've listened to 17 times since that morning in my childhood bedroom, and I still feel the same cold, quiet shock each time. He said, "I really hope you don't do something you'll regret." That was all. 7 words, said in the same calm tone as everything else, and then the subject changed. And they talked logistics for another 10 minutes, and the recording ended. 7 words. My father drove home from Nashville, and 2 weeks later, he was dead on the sidewalk on Magnolia and 3rd. I did not go out to the kitchen and confront my brother. I know that might be hard to understand. But I sat there in my childhood bedroom with my father's recording in my ears, and I thought about those 7 words, and I thought about what it would mean to walk out there and say what I knew. Kevin was bigger than me. Kevin was calm in ways I had never been calm. And Kevin, I was beginning to understand, was capable of things I had not previously considered. I texted Mr. Pruitt instead. I said I needed to talk to him again. He replied within 4 minutes. I can meet you tonight. Come to the office, I'll leave the back door open. Kevin called me for dinner around 6. I said I had a headache and wasn't hungry. He knocked on my door an hour later to check on me, and I said I was just going to sleep early, and I lay there on the twin bed I'd slept in as a teenager and listened to him move around the house, and I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood, which was afraid of my brother. I slipped out at 9 through the back door. Mr. Pruitt had made coffee after all. He sat across from me in the lamplight and I told him about the audio files and he was quiet for a long time. I want to be careful here, he said finally. Your father died of a heart attack. The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play. I don't want to, he paused. I don't want to build a case out of fear when grief might be doing the building. But, I said, there's a but. He reached into his desk and pulled out a printed page. 3 days before your father drove to Nashville, he had a full, physical, clean bill of health. His doctor. I spoke with her. I hope you don't mind. She told me she was surprised by the heart attack. She said there was nothing in his profile that suggested imminent risk. I looked at the printed page. It was a summary of Dad's medical records. Completely normal. There's one more thing, Mr. Pruitt said. He looked uncomfortable. Your father called me the evening before he died. I didn't get to the phone in time. He left a voicemail. He turned his phone around on the desk so I could see the screen. There was a saved voicemail from 6 days ago. My father's name. I don't know if I can, I said. You don't have to listen now. But it exists. I picked up the phone. I pressed play. Dad's voice was different in the voicemail. Not different in a way I could easily describe. Just tighter, quieter, like someone speaking carefully around something large and heavy in the room. He said, Walter, it's Bobby. Listen, I need to talk to you tomorrow. Something happened today that I think you need to know about. Kevin called me this afternoon. He said the 60 days weren't going to work. He said, well, I'd rather tell you in person. I just wanted you to know in case I'm not thinking about this clearly. I'll call you in the morning. He never called in the morning. I set the phone down on the desk very carefully. Like it was something breakable. He was trying to tell you, I said. Mr. Pruitt nodded. His eyes were tired. I have been carrying this since the morning of the funeral, he said. I didn't know what to do with it. The police would tell me it's circumstantial. And it is. I know it is. But your father trusted me to give you that folder, so I'm giving you everything I have. I thought about my brother at the kitchen table with his laptop, his rolling suitcase, his questions about the will. What would you do, I asked, if you were me? Mr. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I would find out what's on that drive that you haven't read yet, he said, and I would be very careful about who knows what you know. There was a second folder on the flash drive, not financial records, documents. The first was a copy of my father's business insurance policy, Keyman Insurance, a policy taken out years ago when he'd briefly had a business partner, naming the surviving owner as beneficiary. The partner had left years back. The policy had never been updated. The beneficiary of record was Kevin. The policy was worth $400,000. $400,000, payable to my brother upon my father's death. I sat with that information for a long time. Outside my bedroom window, I could hear Kevin watching something on television in the living room. The low sound of a laugh track. He had always liked comedies. The second document was a letter from my father's attorney, dated the week of his Nashville trip, acknowledging receipt of instructions to update the policy beneficiary. The update had been submitted, but it took 30 days to process. My father died on day 18. The beneficiary of record at the time of his death was still Kevin. My brother stood to collect $400,000. $400,000 plus the $240 he'd already taken. That was the number I kept coming back to, not as an abstraction, as a thing my father had built over 30 years, with his hands and his honesty and his early mornings, slowly and carefully the way he built houses. And my brother had looked at that and decided it was worth more to him than my father's life. I made a decision sitting there on that twin bed. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to call the police that night and have them tell me it was circumstantial and watch Kevin collect that insurance check and walk away. I was going to get him to say what he'd done. On record, without him knowing. I had learned, from my father's mistake, that hope and a 60-day window were not a strategy. The next 2 weeks were the hardest performance of my life. Every morning I walked out to the kitchen and made coffee and said good morning to my brother and let him believe I was drowning. He was not difficult to deceive. Kevin had always assumed, somewhere below the surface, that I was the one who needed managing. It was built into the architecture of how he saw us. The older brother. The competent one. I let him be competent. I said the estate paperwork was overwhelming me. I said I didn't know where to start with the business. I cried twice in front of him, genuinely, and both times he put a hand on my shoulder and said he'd handle it. That's what family was for. The word family tasted like something rotten each time he said it. He started asking about the business, gently at first, then with more direction. He suggested they should probably look into selling. The company was small, the market was good, there might be interested buyers. He'd done some research, he said. He knew a developer out of Atlanta who might want to talk. He also brought up the insurance policy, very casually, over breakfast. Said he'd noticed it in Dad's files and that they should probably contact the insurer soon, that there were time limits on claims. I said I didn't know anything about it. I let confusion move across my face. He explained it to me patiently, the way he always explained things. I am your big brother, his tone always said. I know how these things work. That night, I ordered a small recording device online. It arrived 2 days later. I'd been in contact with Mr. Pruitt throughout, through encrypted messages on an app he'd downloaded at my suggestion. Cautious. Both of us cautious. He knew a woman, a former client who'd been through her own version of this, a legal matter involving a family member and forged documents, who had referred him to a private investigator in Atlanta named Doris Whitfield. I met Doris at a diner off I-75 on a Friday afternoon. She was 60, sharp-eyed, and ordered black coffee and a piece of lemon cake and didn't waste time. She listened to everything. She looked at the documents. She listened to 30 seconds of the audio recording from Nashville and held up a hand to stop it. "What's your goal?" she said. "Evidence," I said. "Enough to take to law enforcement that they can't dismiss." She nodded. "Here's what you need to understand. What you have now tells a story, but stories need corroboration. The insurance policy and the timing are compelling. The audio is useful, but a defense attorney would call it ambiguous. The voicemail is hearsay. So what do I need? You need him to talk. On record. About the money. About the insurance. About the conversation he had with your father before your father died. You need him to say something that can't be explained away. How do I get that?" Doris looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has helped people like me before. "You make him think he's already won," she said. The opportunity came 10 days later. Mr. Pruitt called me. He'd received a letter from the insurance company acknowledging Kevin's claim on the policy. Kevin had filed it without telling me. He'd used our father's death certificate and his own documentation as the named beneficiary. Technically legal, completely in keeping with who my brother was. I didn't react when Mr. Pruitt told me. I thanked him and hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store for about 20 minutes watching people push carts in and out of the entrance, ordinary and unhurried, existing in a world where their fathers were alive and their brothers were just brothers. Then I called Kevin. I told him I'd found some of Dad's business files, and there were some things I didn't understand. Would he come over to the house that evening and walk me through them? I let my voice be soft, slightly uncertain. "Of course," Kevin said. I set up the recording device before he arrived. Small enough to be invisible, placed inside the ceramic bowl of keys and mail on the entryway table where every conversation in that house had always happened, where my parents had debated grocery lists and school schedules and every ordinary decision of a family life. I tested it twice. Then I put on the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral and waited. Kevin arrived with takeout containers in that easy manner of his, and we sat at the kitchen table and he spread out papers and started explaining things, and I asked questions. And for the first 40 minutes it was almost exactly what it looked like. A brother helping a sister understand their father's estate. Then I said, I found Dad's other files, the ones on the drive he left with Mr. Pruitt. The shift was small. Kevin's face didn't change, not exactly, but something behind his eyes did. I didn't know Dad had left anything with Pruitt, he said. He did. There was a lot in there. Financial records, mostly. What kind of financial records? His voice was careful. The kind that show money moving out of the company accounts. From your laptop? Over 18 months. Silence. I watched my brother's face go through several things very fast. Then it settled into something I recognized from the recording, that careful stillness. I think, he said, that you might be looking at things out of context. $240,000 is a lot of context. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad wasn't well. His memory, in the last year or two, he was making mistakes, misattributing transactions. I have the audio, I said. Another silence. Longer this time. He told me he recorded the conversation in Nashville. I've listened to it, all 42 minutes. Kevin set down his fork. I also heard his voicemail to Mr. Pruitt, I said, the one from the night before he died, where he said you'd called him that afternoon, where he said you told him the 60 days weren't going to work. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking. The same neighbor's dog, as always. You don't know what that means, Kevin said. His voice had gone flat. I know that Dad had a clean physical 3 weeks before he died. I know the beneficiary change was 18 days from processing. I know you filed the insurance claim without telling me. Kevin stood up. I think I should go. You took the money because you needed it. I said it quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact. And then Dad found out. And he gave you 60 days, and you decided 60 days was too long to wait. My brother looked at me from across the kitchen table. The table where we had eaten thousands of meals as children, where Dad had helped us with homework and Mom had paid bills and the ordinary architecture of a family had been constructed year by year out of small, repeated moments. He said, You don't have any proof of anything. I have the voicemail, I said. I have the audio. I have 18 months of bank records. I have a policy beneficiary change that your father initiated the same week he confronted you and died before it processed. I have Doris Whitfield. He blinked at the last name. He didn't know who she was, but the specificity of it landed. I have Walter Pruitt, I said. And I have this. I reached into my bag and placed a small printed document on the table. It was a summary that Doris had helped me compile. The dates. The amounts. The timeline from Nashville to Magnolia and 3rd. Kevin stared at it. His face had gone very still. I didn't. He started. His face had gone very still. I didn't. He started, then stopped. I waited. The silence stretched out between us, and in it I heard everything my father's voice had ever sounded like. On Sunday phone calls and bad puns and patient questions about a job he didn't understand. And I thought about him walking alone on that 2-mile loop. And I thought about the dog coming home without him. And I held very still and let my brother sit with what he'd done. He didn't kill Dad, Kevin said. Not like... It wasn't like that. I told him the money situation was more serious than 60 days could fix. I told him that if he went to the police before I could get clear, things would get very complicated for everyone. I was trying to buy time. He bought time with a threat, I said. I didn't threaten him. I just explained the situation. And then he died. Kevin pressed his hands flat on the table. His jaw worked. I didn't do anything to Dad, he said. I didn't touch him. He had a heart attack. Maybe, I said. Or maybe the stress of knowing his son had stolen $250,000 and then threatened him did something to his heart. Either way, you watched him die, and your first call was to the insurance company. Kevin's face crumbled then. Not all at once. In pieces, the careful control falling away bit by bit, and underneath it something that looked less like guilt and more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been managing a terrible thing for a very long time and is finally too tired to keep managing it. I owed money to people who don't give extensions, he said. I was desperate. I don't know what I thought. I thought I'd replace it before he noticed. And then he noticed, and I panicked. And then he stopped. The recording device sat in the ceramic bowl, 6 feet away, and recorded all of it. I know you didn't plan for him to die, I said. But he's dead. And you have his money, and I can't let that be the end of this story. What are you going to do? Kevin said. His voice was very quiet. I'm going to do what Dad asked me to do, I said. He left me those files because he trusted me to know what to do with them. So I'm going to give them to someone who can make sure this goes where it needs to go. Doris Whitfield had a contact at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. She had spent the previous 10 days laying groundwork. The recording I made that night at the kitchen table, combined with my father's audio files and Mr. Pruitt's documentation, was enough for them to open a formal investigation. The insurance claim was frozen within 48 hours. Kevin was interviewed 3 days after that. He did not have the composure in a formal interview room that he had in my father's kitchen. He'd had a lawyer present, but the lawyer couldn't explain away 18 months of financial records or the 42 minutes of recorded audio. Kevin's gambling creditors, it turned out, were exactly the kind of people the GBI was already interested in, which made everything considerably more complicated for my brother and considerably more useful for investigators. The medical examiner revisited my father's case. Stress-induced cardiac events are difficult to prosecute. I understood that going in. What they could prove, and did, was wire fraud and theft. $243,000 over 22 months, with a paper trail that my father had been methodical enough to preserve entirely. Kevin was arrested 6 weeks after I sat across from him at that kitchen table. He is currently awaiting trial. The insurance payout was suspended pending the outcome. The company, Hadley Construction, which my father had built from 2 trucks and the equipment lease into a business worth more than the insurance policy 3 times over, is still operating. I hired an actual office manager. I drive down from Atlanta twice a month. I am learning more than I ever expected to know about load-bearing walls and foundation work and what it means to build something that lasts. Walter Pruitt is still the accountant. He cried briefly when I called to tell him Kevin had been arrested. Then he composed himself and said, "Your father always said you were the one who would handle things right." I told him I wasn't sure I'd handled it right so much as just not looked away. I still hear the dog sometimes when I stay at the house in Millbrook. Still hear it bark once in the early morning and go quiet. Still reach in those first fuzzy seconds before I'm fully awake for a world where my father is just around the corner on Magnolia and 3rd, finishing his walk, about to come home. Then I wake up, and I get up, and I make coffee, and I do the next thing. That's what he taught me. You show up. You do the work. You build things that are honest. I visited Kevin in the county detention facility once. I needed to do it, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just been carrying a version of him in my head that was larger than the real thing. He asked me why I'd gone to Mr. Pruitt, how I'd known to trust him. I said, because Dad trusted him, and Dad was a good judge of character when it came to everyone except you. Kevin didn't say anything to that. I didn't wait for him to. On the way out, I passed a woman in the parking lot carrying a toddler on her hip, the child squirming and grabby and fully alive, and I stood beside my car for a moment in the Georgia afternoon and thought about my father walking his 2-mile loop, and about the 63 pages he'd never finished, and about what it means to try to protect someone from a truth that's already in motion. He shouldn't have driven to Nashville alone. He should have called me first. He tried to handle it the way he handled everything. quietly within the family, believing that family was a container strong enough to hold it. But I understand why. I would have wanted to believe that too. The drive from Atlanta to Millbrook is 4 hours and takes me through 3 counties and 2 different versions of Georgia and past a roadside stand that sells boiled peanuts that my father loved and I have always found revolting. I stop there every time now. I buy a bag. I sit in the car and eat them in his memory and think about him saying that a house is only as honest as the man who built it. He built honest things. I'm going to make sure that counts for something. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say it was the confrontation at the kitchen table, or the weeks of pretending I didn't know, or sitting across from my brother in that detention facility watching him look smaller than he ever had. But the hardest part was actually the drive home from Walter's office that first morning, when I had my father's folder on the passenger seat, and the recording of his voice still sitting inside my chest like something I'd swallowed wrong. Because in that car, before I had a plan, before I had Doris or a recording device or any idea what I was going to do, in that car I had a choice. I could put the folder in a drawer somewhere and let Kevin have his insurance check and his story about a grieving brother and let my father's death mean whatever the path of least resistance needed it to mean. I was 31 years old and exhausted, and my father was 6 days in the ground, and nobody would have blamed me for not having the strength for any of it. What I keep coming back to, when I think about why I didn't do that, is something much simpler than courage. It was just that I kept hearing my father's voice on that voicemail. The way he said, "I'll call you in the morning." Like morning was a thing he could count on. Like time was still something that belonged to him. He was already careful enough to document everything. He trusted me enough to leave me the folder. He did his part. The least I could do was do mine. There's something I've come to believe about the way actions accumulate, not in any mystical sense, just practically, mechanically. Kevin spent 4 years in close proximity to my father's trust and his patience and his willingness to believe the best of his son, and Kevin used every one of those years to build something that served only himself. The choices compounded. The distance between who he was and who he was pretending to be grew, quietly, until the gap was $240,000 wide, and there was no way to close it without destroying something. And my father's choices compounded too. His honesty, his record-keeping, his decision to trust Walter Pruitt with something he couldn't carry alone, those things accumulated into the folder that ended up on my passenger seat, into the audio file that 42 minutes of hard conversation produced, into the voicemail that said, quietly and without knowing it was final, that something was wrong. What you build over time is what survives you. That's the thing I keep learning from all of this. Kevin built debt and cover stories and a careful performance of a devoted son, and when the pressure came, all of it collapsed at once. My father built 30 years of honest work and careful records and relationships with people who trusted him, and when he was gone, those things held. They held long enough to reach me. They held long enough to matter. I am not the same person I was before Walter Pruitt called me. I don't think that's a bad thing. I know now that I can sit across a table from someone I love and hold what I know quietly until the right moment. I know I can be afraid and do the necessary thing anyway. I know the difference between protecting someone and enabling them, which is a distinction my father tried to honor and paid for trying. Hadley Construction is still standing. I'm learning how to run it. I stop at that boiled peanut stand every time I drive down, and I sit in the car and think about my dad, and I let myself miss him without letting the missing swallow everything else. That's the work now. The daily, unglamorous work of building something honest in the middle of a life that didn't go the way anyone planned. He said a house is only as honest as the man who built it. I think that's true of everything we make.